At 6:12 in the freezing light of February 12, 1944, Captain Robert Hale stood inside Test Bay 3 at Aberdeen Proving Ground with his breath drifting like smoke over a steel table. He was 32, lean from too many hours without sleep, a former Pacific Theater ordnance evaluator who had seen more men wounded by experimental weapons than by the enemy itself. His record looked impressive on paper: 112 weapons tested, dozens cleared for field trials, but between the lines sat the statistic that never left him alone: 4 crews injured in a single month because prototypes had hidden flaws no inspection caught. That number lived behind his eyes every time he picked up a clipboard. And this morning, what lay on the table in front of him felt wrong before anybody even touched it: a strange, pre-war European rifle pulled out of a Belgian warehouse, coated in dust thick enough to write names in. I'm Berg, and if you love the kind of World War II stories that were almost erased by silence, make sure you subscribe right now to Firepower World War II. We dig into the forgotten corners of these arsenals because the truth is almost never where the official reports claim it is. Now back to Hale, and the rifle that should have never left that Belgian warehouse alive. The bigger picture of why this weapon ended up here was simple but deadly. In early 1944, the Allies were desperate for dependable rifles that could survive the mud fields of Italy and the frozen hedgerows of northeastern France. Command wanted something accurate, rugged, and cheap enough to mass-produce fast. Hale's job, his burden, was to evaluate captured or obscure rifles to see whether any could be reworked for Allied production lines. Enter the Belgian mystery rifle, full-length, traditional wood furniture, blued steel that looked solid at first glance, and chambered for a cartridge dangerously close to German 7.92 by 57 mm ballistics. If it worked, it might have given frontline units a penetration advantage they lacked. But if it didn't, Hale had already buried enough men to know what failure looked like. The enemy had a decisive edge the Allies felt every day. Late-war German formations fielded semi-auto rifles and machine rifles with exceptional range and terrifying consistency. Even a mediocre marksman with a Kar 98K could reliably punch through Allied helmets at 200 yards. Allied rifles, by comparison, struggled when soaked, clogged, or fired in rapid succession. Numbers told the story better than any officer's speech. In test conditions, German rifles maintained functional accuracy for 40 rounds of sustained fire. Many Allied prototypes choked before 15. Hale hated math, but these were the numbers that killed people. And there was a clear pattern: every time an Allied prototype promised to match or exceed German penetration, it failed under stress conditions the Germans had already mastered. Mud, cold, stress spikes, chamber warping. The Belgian rifle on his table was the latest attempt to break that pattern, and Hale had a bad feeling just from the weight of it in his hands. He had reason to be wary. He could still name every man whose blood stained the concrete under Test Bay 5. Sergeant Wilkins, a farm kid from Texas who used to talk about going home to build the world's biggest barn, died when a prototype split open on a third-round pressure test. Corporal Lenny, a machinist from Pittsburgh with hands like anvils, lost his sight in a flashback that should have been impossible. Private Milo Anders, quiet accountant from Chicago, was cut down when a sheared bolt carrier shot across the room like a thrown axe. None of these men were careless. None were poorly trained. They were good, careful, steady hands, men who trusted the equipment handed to them. Hale felt every death as if he'd pulled the triggers himself. So when he looked at the Belgian rifle and saw almost no chamber wear, no pitting, no micro-scarring, something tightened in his chest. It was too clean. Rifles that had seen real service always told a story: burn tracks, heat lines, carbon shading. This one looked like a weapon in denial. Hale logged measurements with a sinking feeling that he'd missed something obvious. At the same time, the same question kept circling him like a vulture: how do you even test a rifle whose danger isn't visible? The narrator's voice could have spoken for him. How do you trust steel you can't see into? How do you judge a weapon that hides its intent behind perfect metal? And how do you keep testers alive when every assumption about acceptable metallurgy might be a lie? The doctrine said rifles that passed basic stress inspection were safe. But Hale knew better. European factories under occupation cut corners all the time. Wartime alloys varied. Pressure curves didn't lie, steel did. The conceptual problem was simple and terrifying. Traditional Allied inspection methods relied on visible cues, discoloration, racking marks, measurable deformation. But there existed a category of hidden microfractures too fine for the eye, too shallow to reflect in the standard borescope lamps. They sat beneath the surface like trapped lightning, waiting for one perfect pressure spike to rip open the rifle and anyone near it. That was the blind spot. Doctrine couldn't catch what doctrine didn't believe existed. Hale stared at the rifle for nearly a full minute before a memory hit him like a hammer, something from the Pacific, from a gunsmith on Luzon who checked cracked chambers using a soapy graphite mixture painted onto the metal. It wasn't regulation. It wasn't scientific. Engineers dismissed it as tribal superstition. But Hale had seen the method work once on an old Nambu. He remembered the Filipino man telling him, in broken English, "Steel hides like a liar. Graphite makes it confess." Hale had laughed then. Now the words crawled up his spine. It was an idea so simple it bordered on ridiculous. Even worse, it was absolutely unauthorized. Hale could be thrown off the program for contaminating a weapon surface with foreign substances. But the alternative was watching another man die on his watch. He turned off the overhead lamps and locked the door to the bay. The night crew had already gone to chow. If anyone caught him improvising, there'd be questions. Long questions with short career paths. He gathered what he needed quietly: a cup, a sliver of shaved graphite, a little dish soap, a toothbrush, a cloth. Nothing that looked like the tools of a man about to challenge official ordnance doctrine. The hangar at night felt like a church: echoes, drafts, the metallic scent of oil and dust. Hale mixed the solution under the dim cone of a desk lamp, brushed it inside the chamber, and waited for it to dry. While he waited, he rigged a crude test harness using a truck winch cable, locking the rifle down so that if it failed catastrophically, it would fail in one direction. On his first attempt, the solution slid too fast across the wall. He wiped it clean, slowed his stroke, and tried again. The second attempt bubbled oddly, leaving splotches that told him nothing. He reset the harness, adjusted the angle of the lamp by millimeters, and fought down the fear that he was one loud clatter away from a court-martial. On the third attempt, a wrench slipped from the table and struck the floor. The sound echoed so violently he froze, breath held, waiting for footsteps. None came. He pressed on. When he finally rotated the chamber toward the lamp, the air felt electric. Graphite dust had settled into thin vertical fissures, hair-thin, but real. Dozens of them. The entire chamber wall was layered like shale rock, beautiful and deadly. Hale whispered one dry word to himself: there. It meant the rifle wasn't just unsafe. It was a fragmentation bomb disguised as a firearm. And tomorrow, at noon, it would be test-fired in front of American, British, and Canadian observers expecting nothing more than a routine semi-auto demonstration. Hale kept staring at those fractures, knowing exactly what would happen when the bullet met that brittle steel. But the graphite test had worked. It had revealed what no regulation manual believed existed. And for the first time in months, Hale felt something he hadn't felt since Wilkins died in front of him: the faint, stubborn lift of certainty. He might actually keep somebody alive tomorrow. The next morning came in with a low ceiling of gray clouds and a cold so sharp it felt like it was cutting the air rather than passing through it. Hale barely slept. He kept seeing those thin graphite dark lines inside the chamber, fractures too clean, too parallel, too deliberate looking to be natural. When he arrived at Test Bay 3, the Canadian observers were already there, passing around a thermos of coffee. A British major stood reviewing paperwork, stiff as always, and two slow-motion camera technicians were adjusting their tripods. Nobody suspected a thing. To them, today would be another checkpoint on a long list of routine trials. To Hale, it was a countdown to an explosion disguised as science. He walked up to the firing table, trying to look neutral. His right hand trembled with the memory of Wilkins' helmet split in two on the concrete floor months earlier. The Belgian rifle rested in a harness exactly where he had left it, clamped down to prevent unpredictable recoil. He double-checked the cable tension and caught the Canadian lieutenant glancing at him, maybe surprised at how meticulous he was being. Hale didn't care. He inserted a single cartridge, just one, and stepped back behind the blast shield. Even behind the shield, he felt exposed. The chamber fissures were still burned into his mind. He squared his shoulders, forced a steady breath, and said, "On your mark." The British major nodded to the camera team. A red light flicked on. Silence settled like dust. Hale pulled the remote trigger cord. The rifle fired with a roar that was nothing like a normal shot. It was a ripping, metallic scream, the sound of steel being torn open under lightning pressure. The barrel peeled apart in four jagged petals, erupting forward in a directional blast so violent the shockwave staggered one of the observers. A shard of steel, moving faster than sound, knifed downrange and buried itself in a sand berm 40 yards away. Smoke hung in a thick, acrid cloud. One of the camera techs cursed under his breath. The British major just stared, lips parted. The Canadians exchanged looks somewhere between awe and horror. No one spoke for a full 5 seconds. Then the British major whispered, "Good God, what in blazes was that?" Hale didn't answer. He already knew. Everyone now knew. The terrifying test had confirmed the truth the graphite had revealed. The rifle was death disguised as innovation. And if they had loaded a full magazine, someone in this room would likely be bleeding on the floor. Word of the blast moved through Aberdeen faster than rumors usually did. By the afternoon, 2 colonels, a metallurgical engineer, and a documentation officer were in Hale's Bay demanding explanations, measurements, evidence. Hale showed them the graphite traces, the photographs he secretly took under the desk lamp, the improvised harness he'd built to keep the weapon from disintegrating in their faces. At first, the colonels looked either skeptical or annoyed. Unauthorized testing methods were a bureaucratic nightmare. But the blast footage played on a projector, and the room fell silent again. The engineer, gray-haired, wire-framed glasses, examined the barrel remains under a magnifier and muttered that no military standard alloy should ever fail like this. The colonels argued quietly near the door. Hale kept his hands behind his back, waiting for the questions he knew were coming. They didn't take long. "Captain Hale," one colonel said, "who authorized the use of this graphite procedure?" Hale swallowed. "Nobody, sir." "And you applied foreign material to a captured weapon during active evaluation?" "Yes, sir." The colonel's jaw tightened. "You are aware that such modifications violate—" A knock interrupted him. Another officer entered, carrying a fresh set of pressure readings from the blast site. He handed them over wordlessly. The colonel scanned them, blinked once, and looked back at Hale with a different expression, no longer reprimanding, more calculating. The truth was obvious. Without Hale's unauthorized method, they would have fired a full magazine. They would have sent a man into the harness to test cycling. They might have killed half a team of evaluators. The colonel folded the papers slowly. "This weapon is to be sealed," he said. "Locked. Filed under restricted testing materials. Quietly removed from all further evaluation." In plain English, it meant the weapon was banned. Not publicly. Not loudly. But absolutely. And then came the sentence Hale expected but still felt like a punch. This report, the colonel said, will list structural failure as the cause of malfunction. Standard test protocol. No unofficial procedures will be mentioned. Hale stared at him. Sir, the fractures. Captain, the colonel cut in, the findings will be recorded in accordance with Ordnance Regulation 14B. That is final. His discovery, his sleepless nights, his risk, his improvised harness, all of it was about to be buried under the neat handwriting of a man who likely didn't know the difference between chamber throating and bolt setback. Hale kept his face blank. Field reality rarely matched the version stenographers wanted the world to see. Yet something unexpected happened. By the next morning, other test officers were quietly asking questions. One approached Hale in the hallway, eyes lowered, and asked if the thing he'd done with the graphite really worked. Hale nodded once. Word spread, the kind of word that was never written down but moved through hands and tool benches and mess halls. Within a week, 2 separate teams had begun performing their own unofficial chamber checks. Within 2 weeks, the metallurgical lab incorporated a modified version of Hale's method into pre-fatigue inspections. Nobody referenced him by name. Still, the effect was unmistakable. The numbers told the story. Before the graphite method, catastrophic chamber faults appeared maybe once in every 200 evaluations. Afterward, the detection rate jumped 4-fold. Several prototypes destined for advanced field tests were pulled and scrapped quietly. A few would have been shipped to units in Italy or France if somebody hadn't swept graphite across their chambers and watched the fall smoothness fall apart into fissures. Enemy rifles were also revealing flaws. Captured late-war German designs, some built under the collapsing industrial desperation of 1944, cracked like stale bread under the same method. Hale realized the Belgian rifle had been a warning, an exaggerated version of a wider metallurgical rot spreading through occupied Europe. But as the graphite method spread underground, friction with regulations grew just as quickly. One morning, an inspection officer walked into Hale's bay unannounced and caught Corporal Jenkins, a junior tech, brushing a test rifle with a mixture that looked very familiar. The officer blew his stack, demanding to know who authorized such contamination. He began shouting about dishonorable conduct, chain of custody violations, and how the Ordnance Corps did not operate according to jungle folk remedies. Hale stepped forward and took the blame. Jenkins looked like he might faint from relief. The officer launched into another tirade, threatening a formal review board. But the moment he reached for the phone, the engineering division chief entered the room, having just watched the catastrophic Belgian test footage that morning. He tapped the officer on the shoulder, whispered a few clipped words into his ear, and the room changed temperature instantly. The officer swallowed his anger, stiffened, and left without another complaint. Nobody explained the details, but the message was clear. Hale's method was no longer considered a transgression. It was now a quiet necessity. Higher command would never admit it, but they knew. They had seen the blast in slow motion. They had seen the shard bury itself 40 yards into the sand. They had read the metallurgical fractures showing how thin the line between innovation and disaster really was. Still, Hale didn't feel vindicated. He felt tired. He felt like he was standing in the thin space between what should happen and what could never be officially acknowledged. On his lunch tray in the mess hall, the mashed potatoes blurred as he replayed the explosion again and again. He kept thinking of Milo Anders, who never saw the bolt carrier that killed him. He kept thinking of Wilkins. Of Lenny. The graphite had worked, but too late for them. And yet, for the first time in what felt like years, he sensed a shift in the air around him. Men were talking differently. Engineers were checking differently. The quiet machinery of survival had begun turning in a new direction. The Belgian rifle, ugly as it was, had changed something fundamental. 2 weeks later, Hale arrived at a morning briefing to find half the seats occupied by officers he didn't recognize. They weren't from Aberdeen. Their uniforms were too crisp, their boots too clean. They were from headquarters. They reviewed files, asked pointed questions, and scribbled notes without making eye contact. An aide set a metal case on the table. Inside were fragments of the Belgian rifle, tagged and numbered, as if it were evidence from a crime scene. The highest-ranking officer in the room cleared his throat and said only this: "This platform will not be considered for adoption by any allied partner. Its design characteristics present unacceptable hazards. This matter is closed." No acknowledgement of Hale. No recognition of what had actually saved the evaluation team. No record that anything unusual had happened. The story was sealed in a folder stamped with the word restricted in thick black ink. But on the factory floor, on the test ranges, in dim workshops late at night, the graphite mixture had already become a quiet gospel, passed from one careful set of hands to another. A technique unnamed, undocumented, but indispensable. Hale finished the day's paperwork long after everyone else had gone home. The Belgian rifle's shattered barrel lay on his desk, twisted like the petals of some metallic flower. He rotated it under the lamp. The fractures caught the light, rippling like scars. He pressed his thumb to the jagged steel and closed his eyes, breathing out slowly. He didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning of the rifle's strange journey, one that would stretch decades beyond the war, long after the official record had forgotten everything except the part that was easiest to write down. Hale didn't speak much about the Belgian rifle after the incident. Men in his position rarely did. The war ground forward, the test bays filled with new arrivals every week, and the graphite method became so quietly embedded into routine inspections that nobody even called it a method anymore. It was simply something good evaluators did, just one more unspoken line of defense to keep somebody else alive. But as 1945 dragged itself toward its final months and the Allied war machine began to slow its roaring pace, Hale found himself thinking more often about the aftermath than the war itself. When he left the service in early 1946, he stepped out of the gates at Aberdeen with a single duffel bag and a thin envelope containing his discharge papers. He returned to Oregon and opened a small gunsmithing shop on the outskirts of Salem, far from the laboratories where steel behaved like a trickster spirit. He repaired deer rifles, cleaned shotguns, reblued worn barrels, and listened to old men tell stories about the ones that got away. He hung a small wooden sign over the door, "Hale Sporting Arms." Nothing on that sign told the truth of what he had done. On a shelf above his workbench sat one item he never explained to customers, a twisted scrap of the Belgian rifle's receiver, charred black from the blast. Every few weeks, he would take it down, rotate it in the lamplight, and study the warped metal. He wasn't sure whether he kept it as a reminder of the danger or as a confirmation that he had finally learned how to see past steel's lies. Some nights he wiped it clean with the same cloth he used on a client's Winchester. Some nights he simply placed it back on the shelf and went home without a word. He stayed in touch with a few of the men from Aberdeen. Every December he mailed Christmas cards to the families of Wilkins, Linney, and Anders. He never knew whether the cards were appreciated or whether they brought more pain, but he sent them anyway. He wrote short messages inside each one, simple words, plain words, the kind a man writes when he knows he can't fix what was broken but wants the families to know he remembers. When he set down his pen, he always looked at the twisted scrap of rifle steel and felt the same hollow weight in his chest. The years passed. Hale married once, quietly, and lost his wife to illness before their 10th anniversary. He kept his shop going, and men trusted his hands even if they didn't know why. He had a reputation for caution, for spotting cracks and stress lines where others saw nothing wrong. Clients joked that he could hear a chamber talk. Hale usually smiled and said nothing. The truth was that every time he caught a fault that might have hurt somebody, he felt like he was paying down a debt he could never fully erase. In 1992, on a rainy afternoon when the Oregon sky looked like old pewter, a military historian named Evan Martin walked into his shop carrying a folder under one arm. Martin had spent years digging through ordnance logs and footnotes for a book on Allied testing procedures. He discovered Hale's name in a single obscure note attached to a metallurgical report from 1944. It intrigued him enough to track the captain down. He introduced himself politely, then asked a question Hale hadn't heard in nearly 50 years. "Captain Hale, did you ever conduct an unauthorized chamber evaluation during the Belgian rifle trials?" Hale froze with a cleaning rod in his hands. The memories returned so fast he had to steady himself against the counter. After a long moment he answered, "Yes, I did." Martin listened as Hale told the story piece by piece, not dramatically, not proudly, but with the steady precision of a man who remembered every inch of the test bay floor. The graphite, the improvised harness, the blast, the colonel who buried the truth, Hale laid it all out. When he finished, Martin sat back in his chair and exhaled deeply. "Captain," he said quietly, "you likely saved 40 to 80 men. Maybe more." Hale didn't respond. The number felt unreal. He had never thought in terms of what he had saved, only what he had failed to save before he learned to look differently. But Martin pressed on, and over the next few months he interviewed engineers, surviving testers, and even collected letters from families. He found one from Anders' widow, still living in Illinois, who had never known what caused the explosion that killed her husband. When Martin told her what Hale had uncovered, she wept over the phone, not from anger, but relief. Relief that her husband had not died from incompetence or carelessness. Relief that somebody had carried the truth with them all these years. A small article eventually appeared in a collector's journal, tucked between advertisements for surplus parts and reenactment gear. Only a few hundred people read it. But those who did understood the weight behind its words. Hale was mentioned once, briefly, modestly. Just enough that his name wouldn't be lost entirely. In 2004, Hale passed away quietly in his sleep. At his request there was no military funeral, no folded flag. He asked only that the twisted scrap of rifle steel be buried in the same box as his old ordnance logbook. A last reminder of the line between life and death that only a few men ever saw close enough to understand. Today, in a quiet corner of a Midwestern military museum, sits a glass display case containing fragments of a Belgian rifle explosion. The label reads, "Prototype, origin uncertain. Failed pressure norms." That is all. No mention of Hale. No mention of the graphite. No note about the men who died before the warning was understood. The official record remains polite and shallow. But the real legacy is different. The real legacy is that an exhausted captain in a dimly lit hangar refused to trust the surface of a rifle that looked too clean. He chose to risk punishment rather than let another man step into the harness blind. He broke a rule to save people who didn't even know his name. And the silent safety ritual that grew from that night, passed from one set of hands to another, saved lives long after the war ended. Most people never heard of Robert Hale. Now you have. And remembering him, remembering men like him, is a small way of honoring the fact that behind every safe weapon on a battlefield stands someone who refused to look away from the steel when it mattered most. If hearing stories like this matters to you, if you want these buried files and forgotten names to stay alive, consider liking this video so the algorithm knows it's worth showing to others. Subscribe to join a community of people who help keep these stories from disappearing into dust. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Every story carried forward is a story that survives.